I was standing in the grand ballroom of the Magnolia Grand Hotel in Nashville, where my son's engagement party was being held, when I overheard the bride-to-be whispering to her mother about social class, about her absolute contempt for her future father-in-law. The exact words were, "that filthy backwoods peasant." Have you ever heard the sound of your dignity breaking? Not the soft clink of crystal champagne flutes around the banquet tables. I mean the sound a father's pride makes when it shatters in a room full of strangers wearing $1,000 gowns. I just stood there beneath the blinding glow of imported chandeliers, my old gray suit from 1998 suddenly looking ridiculous next to designer tuxedos and silk dresses. My hands, the same hands that had grown rough and calloused after 40 years of working the soil of Tennessee, were trembling. I tried to hide them in my pockets. I couldn't. The smell of expensive perfume was suffocating. It was nothing like the scent of hay and damp earth after a summer rain on the ranch. Victoria Whitmore stood there looking like an angel painted on a church ceiling, but the words coming out of those crimson lips were pure poison. She had no idea I was standing right behind her. She turned to her mother Vivian and let out a quiet, mocking laugh. The older woman raised a silk handkerchief to her mouth, while looking at me the way someone looks at a stain on a marble floor. They thought I was stupid. They thought this old cattle rancher couldn't understand the polished language of high society. For a moment, I almost turned around and walked out. I wanted to go home, back to the quiet of the ranch, the place where kindness isn't measured by the thickness of a man's wallet. But then a firm hand landed on my shoulder. It was Caleb, my son. He looked straight into my eyes. There was no embarrassment, no hesitation, just a strange, cold calm. He leaned close to my ear and whispered in a low, razor-sharp voice, "Easy, Dad. Tomorrow I'll take everything back." I stared at him, the boy I had raised with sweat and sacrifice after his mother died, and for the first time, I saw something different in his eyes. This wasn't simple anger. This was a plan, a punishment that had already been prepared. What I didn't realize at that moment was that my son's plan was far more devastating than anything I could imagine. But before I tell you what happened next, let me introduce myself. My name is Henry Beaumont. Most folks just call me Hank. I'm a cattle rancher from Tennessee who believes that a promise is a contract written in stone. And the Whitmore family is about to learn the most expensive lesson of their lives. They underestimated an old man who loves his land more than gold, and they made a terrible mistake when they crossed the final line with my son. So tell me, what time is it where you are right now? And have you ever been judged by the size of your wallet instead of the strength of your character? Drop a comment below, because what happened next will completely change the way you think about loyalty. Some snakes wear flawless skin, but out here in Tennessee, we know exactly how to wait them out. After that humiliating engagement party, Caleb led me out to the parking lot. The Nashville night was windy, but sweat was still running down my forehead. I wanted to yell at him. I wanted to demand an answer. I wanted to know why he had stood there and let that woman insult his own father. But Caleb didn't say a word. He guided me into the passenger seat of his truck, locked the doors, and pulled out a small voice recorder. His face was hard, carved like granite. He looked straight at me and said only one thing, "Dad, just listen." The recording began with a brief hiss of static. Then a familiar voice came through the speaker, Victoria. Her voice was no longer sweet like honey. It was sharp, calculating. "That old man is a fool. He'll sign anything his son asks him to." Then came her laughter, cold, the kind of laughter that crawls under your skin and stays there. A moment later, Richard Whitmore's voice cut in. "We need that ranch for the Highway 88 expansion project. Once he signs the power of attorney, 22% of the profit from this flip goes straight into our pockets." Victoria replied with smug confidence, "Don't worry, Daddy. Caleb is completely under my control. After the wedding, that ranch will belong to the Whitmore family." It felt like an invisible hand was tightening around my throat. They didn't want to welcome a father into their family. They wanted to swallow the land that Eleanor had spent her entire life caring for. The 240 acres where I had buried my wife under the old oak tree. To them, I was nothing more than a cheap pawn on their banquet table, a stupid old rancher to be tricked, drained, and discarded. The blood in my veins began to boil. My anger started to push past the pain. I turned to Caleb. "When did you find out about this?" Caleb gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He admitted he had suspected something for a long time. 803 days, to be exact. He had planted miniature recording devices in Richard's home office and in Victoria's private dressing room. He had been collecting every conversation, every plan, every greedy whisper for 2 years and 2 months. That was the moment I realized my son wasn't weak. He had been quietly absorbing every humiliation, every fake smile, every cold kiss, all to build a case. He wasn't just protecting the ranch, he was protecting our family's honor and the memory of his mother. Then he told me something that turned my stomach. The Whitmore family had already done this to 7 other farming families across Tennessee. Forged documents, fake disputes, bankruptcies that conveniently transferred land into Whitmore-owned shell companies. That night, back at the ranch, I couldn't sleep. I stared at my calloused hands under the kitchen light. Those people believed money could buy anything. They believed an old country rancher would be easily crushed by complicated contracts and legal tricks. But they made one terrible mistake. They believed an old lion no longer knew where his claws were. Caleb's plan was just beginning to reveal itself, and somewhere in Nashville, a young AV technician named Marcus Reed was already preparing the most devastating wedding gift the Whitmore family would ever receive. The 3 days before the wedding felt like the longest days of my life. I went back to the ranch. I stood in front of Eleanor's grave under the old oak tree and whispered to her that I would protect everything we had built together. 40 years of sweat, 40 years of cattle moved at sunrise, 40 years of cornfields whispering in the evening wind. None of it was going to fall into Whitmore hands. Caleb wasn't with me anymore. He was in Nashville, finishing the final pieces of the plan. I met Marcus Reed at a small diner off Highway 41, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like burnt ambition. Marcus was a young man with sharp eyes and the kind of hands that looked like they could make magic with electronics. He was the AV technician the Whitmore family had personally hired to handle the sound and lighting for their $1 million wedding. They hired him because he was the best in Tennessee. What they didn't know was that Marcus had been Caleb's closest friend since their freshman year at Tennessee State University. Marcus slid a tablet across the table toward me. He smiled, but there was a quiet rage burning behind his eyes. On the screen, he showed me how he had already accessed the entire presentation system at the Magnolia Grand Hotel. He had quietly embedded the incriminating recordings, every word from Victoria, Richard, and Vivian, directly into the middle of the romantic video montage about Caleb and Victoria's love story. The bomb was planted. All it needed now was a single button. Then Marcus told me something that made the coffee turn to ice in my mouth. The Whitmore family had prepared one final move, a fake contract, a celebration document, they called it. They planned to present it to me during the reception, after the toasts, when I would supposedly be drunk with pride for my son. The document would immediately transfer 22% of the ranch's value into a Whitmore-owned shell company, 3 days before the Highway 88 expansion was publicly announced. Their greed had no limits. It was a black hole that swallowed every trace of decency. I looked at the guest list Marcus pulled up next. 300 names, state senators, real estate developers, 2 cable news anchors, a federal judge. The Whitmore family wanted this wedding to polish their reputation in front of the most powerful people in Tennessee. What they didn't realize was that those same distinguished guests were about to become live witnesses to their public collapse. Marcus also told me he had reached out to one more person, a man named William Cross, a state prosecutor folks called the Iron Arm. Cross had been hunting the Whitmores for years, but never had enough hard evidence, until now. Caleb called me on the final night. His voice was strangely calm. "Wear your best suit, Dad. Walk into that wedding hall with your head held high. Don't be afraid. Don't doubt anything." I sat alone on the dark porch of the ranch house. The cornfields whispered in the wind. I knew that after tomorrow, our lives would never be the same again. And somewhere in Nashville, the snake was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that the lion's claws were already at her door. The morning of the wedding, the sun was shining in a strangely beautiful way. But inside me there was only a terrifying calm. I sat in the very first row on the groom's side, alone. The seat beside me was empty. It was meant for Eleanor, and somehow I could almost feel the warmth of her shoulder against mine, as if she were whispering, "Stay strong, Hank." The chapel inside the Magnolia Grand was decorated with thousands of pure white roses, a perfect illusion of innocence. Victoria walked down the aisle in a wedding gown worth more than my entire ranch's annual income. She smiled brightly at the cameras, but when her eyes drifted past me, I saw it again. The contempt. Still there, hidden beneath layers of imported French makeup. Vivian sat across the aisle, looking at me the way someone might stare at a stray dog that had wandered into a flock of swans. Richard was busy shaking hands with two state senators in the back, laughing cheerfully, perhaps already calculating how many millions he would make from my land once their little scheme succeeded. The pastor began the ceremony. His voice echoed through the chapel. Then the most important moment arrived. The pastor turned to Caleb. "Do you take Victoria Whitmore to be your wife?" The room fell completely silent. Caleb didn't answer right away. He turned and looked at me. Then he looked back at Victoria. He took one step backward, reached over, and gently took the microphone from the pastor's hand. His voice rang out across the chapel, sharp, calm, and steady. "Pastor, before I answer that question, there's something every single person in this room needs to see." A murmur spread through the crowd like fire across dry grass. Richard jumped to his feet. He shouted at the AV booth to cut the screen, but it was already too late. Marcus had pressed the button. The giant screen behind the altar, the one meant to display Caleb and Victoria's romantic photo montage, suddenly went dark. Then a title appeared in blood-red letters: "The Truth About Victoria Whitmore." 300 guests held their breath at once. The video began to play. Instead of romantic memories, the screen showed hidden audio playing over photos of Victoria laughing at private dinners. Her voice echoed through the chapel, like a slap across the face of high society. That filthy backwoods peasant will never even realize he's losing his land. Then came the recording about the Highway 88 expansion, the 22%, the shell companies, Richard's voice, Vivian's voice, every word cataloged, every lie exposed. The elegant faces in the chapel began to twist. Whispers turned into gasps. Gasps turned into open shouting. Victoria stood frozen at the altar, her bouquet slipping from her fingers and crashing onto the marble floor. White petals scattered under the panicked feet of investors and politicians. Her face went from porcelain to ash. The arrogant princess of West Cliff Park was unraveling in front of every powerful person in Tennessee. Richard rushed toward the technical booth, screaming, but Marcus had locked the entire system and vanished. The footage kept playing: forged contracts, manipulated signatures, and proof of 7 other farming families ruined by the Whitmore name long before they ever came after me. Vivian collapsed against a pew, her silk handkerchief slipping uselessly to the floor. In the middle of the chaos, Victoria suddenly dropped to her knees. Her wedding gown looked like a cocoon trapping the liar inside it. She crawled toward Caleb, sobbing, "Please, it's all a misunderstanding. I was forced into it." But Caleb stepped back. There was no trace of love left in his eyes, only cold, surgical disgust. In the middle of that chaos, a tall, middle-aged man stood up from the back of the chapel. It was William Cross, a state prosecutor known across Tennessee as the Iron Arm. He calmly walked toward the altar. No one had invited him, but the moment he stepped forward, the entire chapel fell silent. Cross looked directly at Richard Whitmore. His voice was calm, but heavy with consequence. What every guest just witnessed is not simply a romantic scandal. It constitutes attempted large-scale fraud, conspiracy, and document forgery under Tennessee state law. As a state prosecutor, I cannot ignore something like this. Richard stammered, his face turning purple. "You think you can threaten me, Cross?" Cross only smiled coldly. He pulled out his phone. "I called the Greenfield County Sheriff 15 minutes ago. They're already waiting at the front gate." The sound of police sirens wailed outside the chapel. The heavy oak doors were pushed open, and a group of Tennessee state troopers stepped inside with cold expressions. There was no mercy here, no special treatment for the wealthy. Victoria was still kneeling on the floor. She looked up at the uniformed officers with hollow, stunned eyes. Her tiny tiara had slipped to one side. Strands of golden hair stuck to her face, damp with sweat and tears. She no longer looked like a bride. She looked like a criminal cornered at the end of the road. Richard made one final attempt to reclaim authority. "Do you have any idea who I am?" One officer stepped forward. He didn't say a single word. He simply pulled out a pair of shining steel handcuffs. The cold click echoed through the chapel as they locked around Richard's wrists. That sound marked the end of an empire built on lies. Vivian let out a scream and collapsed to the floor, but no one rushed to help her. The same guests who had once crowded around the family with flattery were now stepping away as if avoiding a contagious disease. The loyalty of high society is as fragile as an eggshell. I watched as troopers escorted Victoria out. 2 officers lifted her to her feet. Her wedding gown dragged across the marble floor, soaking up spilled water and crushed white petals. The pristine fabric was now smeared with dirt and shame. Victoria screamed Caleb's name. She begged for forgiveness. But Caleb stood with his arms folded, his face calm and still like the surface of a quiet lake. He had waited 803 days for this moment. He didn't blink. When news of the arrest spread across social media, other victims began to come forward. The first was Loretta Banks, a thin woman from Chattanooga with tired eyes full of buried sorrow. The Whitmore family had used the same scheme to bankrupt her tobacco farm 7 years earlier. 6 more families joined her. 7 families total, gathered under William Cross. They carried stacks of documents they had protected for years, hoping someday justice would arrive. The trial unfolded under intense public scrutiny. Every recording Caleb had collected was played in court. Every conversation, every greedy whisper, the 22%, the shell companies, the forged signatures. The judge stared at the Whitmore family with the sternest expression I had ever seen. The verdict came down like a hammer. Richard Whitmore, 14 years in federal prison, no bail. Vivian Whitmore, 9 years as an active accomplice. Victoria Whitmore, 11 years for orchestrating romantic deception to commit fraud. All Whitmore assets, frozen. The Westcliff Park mansion, auctioned to compensate every victim. Victoria collapsed and looked toward Caleb with one final desperate plea. He didn't turn away. He wanted to witness the fall of the woman who had once mocked his father. All of the Whitmore family's illegal assets were frozen by federal court order. Their Westcliff Park mansion was auctioned off to compensate every victim. The Tennessee Highway 88 expansion project still moved forward, but now the 22% profit no longer flowed into the pockets of fraudsters. Instead, it was distributed among the 7 farming families who had spent their lives protecting the only soil they had ever known. I looked out through the courthouse window. The afternoon sun stretched golden across the marble floor. Justice had finally been served. Those who believed money could bend the truth had learned the most expensive lesson of their lives. A person's honor is not something that can be bought or sold. The sound of the judge's gavel was still echoing in my mind as Caleb and I drove back to the ranch. The iron gates appeared under the soft glow of sunset. The smell of dry hay and Tennessee soil wrapped around me like the warm embrace of an old friend. I took a deep breath. This was what freedom truly felt like. Caleb didn't go back to Nashville. He decided to stay and rebuild everything with me. The cattle still moved at sunrise. The cornfields still whispered in the evening wind. The 240 acres were finally safe from the shadows of greedy hands. The Highway 88 expansion was redesigned to curve around our ranch, not slice through it. We didn't sell our land. Instead, we partnered with the developers to turn part of the property into a sustainable agricultural model that gave back to other small farming families in Tennessee. One afternoon, Caleb brought someone home. Her name was Hannah Pierce. She was a 3rd-grade teacher at the local elementary school in town. Hannah had gentle eyes and hands that weren't afraid to touch the soil. She looked at the ranch with genuine respect, not because of its $1-million value, but because of the stories and the sweat that had been poured into this land. I watched the 2 of them walking together through the cornfields, and somehow, I knew Eleanor was smiling from above. We had protected her legacy. We had proven that kindness can defeat cunning. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Never ignore your instincts. Trust yourself, even when the whole world tries to make you doubt. Protecting what belongs to you is not selfish. It's dignity. And never be afraid to stand up for the truth. No matter how powerful or wealthy your opponent may be, life can be cruel sometimes, but it is always fair to those who endure. The Whitmore family lost everything because they underestimated the values that matter most. And we regained everything because we never abandoned our roots. Do you think this is the most satisfying ending possible? If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it helps you stay connected to the most powerful and authentic stories. Stories where truth quietly defeats deception. Stories where patience, strategy, and courage bring justice back to broken families. And as always, Thank you for being part of this space. Thank you for listening. Stay strong on your own path. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you again in the next story.